So this is a very short talk on a rather lengthy manuscript. So the plan Mary and I concocted for today is just to review kind of the overarching goal of the field of ecological evolutionary demography, and then just touch on a single example from the book that Mary and I both find interesting. It's actually not from our own work at all, but sort of illustrates some of the points that we want to make. Please do feel free to drop questions into the chat. And just a plug, I'm also at the National Science Foundation right now in the cultural and biological anthropology programs. We are doing outreach in the Anthro department on Friday at your noon, our 3 p.m. So if you're interested in that, please do feel free to come. Okay, so ecological evolutionary demography. And by the way, I think it'd be interesting if you haven't had Rebecca Farrell here. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Okay, bye-bye. Sorry. If you haven't had Rebecca here already, to ask her whether evolutionary demography and biodemography are the same thing. I think she might give you a slightly different answer to that. But ecological evolutionary demography is a sort of term that we decided to coin for this field that's been in existence now for around 30 years at least. And originally, and it's just sort of riffing off of Bobby Lowe and colleagues' publication from 1992, where they sort of introduced the field in the journal Human Nature. And we define it in our chapter as the branch of evolutionary demography that focuses on the potential adaptive value of demographic behavior at the level of the individual. There are some modifications of this as people are thinking about multi-level selection and things like that, but this is a pretty basic definition. So EED, ecological evolutionary demography, effectively merges two fields that have long pursued a set of overlapping interests, often in parallel, but with relatively limited interchange. That's human behavioral ecology or evolutionary ecology, depending on whether you're focused explicitly on behavior or not, and what we in EED sort of think of as mainstream demography. And at this nexus, the kind of overlapping point in this Venn diagram, this is the region, that region is what we are calling ecological evolutionary demography. So to understand what this field is, you have to know what human behavioral ecology is. This is a branch of evolutionary anthropology or biology. Sometimes it also sits in psychology departments, whose goals really are to link variation in socio-ecological circumstances with individuals' behaviors and their outcomes related to fitness or reproductive success. So effectively, behavioral ecologists want to understand how individual variation in things that demographers are also interested in, things like gender, age, other aspects of what we call their phenotype. It could be their height, it could be their facial symmetry if you're an evolutionary psychologist, how all of these individual circumstances affect their behavior, and how that affects variation in reproductive success. In other words, genetic representation in future generations. And so what we're interested in, what we sort of start with the premise that reproductive success drives people's demographic decision-making based on their individual circumstances, and also based on the socio-ecological contexts in which they are embedded. So I won't belabor this because we don't have a lot of time, but one thing that distinguishes human behavioral ecology from what Ruth Mace has called its evil twin, a very sort of stark version of evolutionary psychology, is that we are explicitly interested in explaining variation in human behaviors, and in this case in EED, in human demographic behavior. So why should these fields be, what's the use of an intersection between these fields of demography and HBE or evolutionary ecology? Jamie Jones at Stanford University has provided one thrust of this argument. He says that demography lies at the heart of every statement about selection. And why is that? Because as the mathematical modelers among you know, the formal definition of fitness is actually derived from demographic models in which fitness is modeled as a growth rate. So your genetic representation in future generations depends not only on how many children you have, which is sort of the version that we give to people who are, to high school children and things like that, high school students, but also when you have them, earlier being greater in terms of genetic representation in growing populations, and what others in your population are also doing. So if you have 2 children when others are having 1, it means something different than if you're having 2 children when everyone else in your population is having 6. So population structure matters a lot in thinking about fitness, and it's easy to lose sight of that. So this is an important, understanding this is important for human behavioral ecologists. And then for demographers, Claudia Valencia at Yale has also given sort of the other arm of this argument, which is that all of the things that are of interest to demographers, mortality and fertility, possibly with a lesser extent migration, but we can make arguments about that too, are clearly biological in nature. So it's not just sufficient to count births and deaths, which is sometimes what happens in early demography courses. If you want to understand the processes that affect population, we also have to understand the biology that's central to their causes. Another important contribution, we think, to demography from behavioral ecology or anthropology, other areas of anthropology, is theory. I think more before, and this is a little bit of a straw person, but that demography can often be conducted in a way that's sort of inductive and data-driven and bottom-up. That's what Mike Girvin and Hilly Kaplan described it, sort of characterized the field that way, using patterns in the data to generate theory. Versus HBE historically, this is also changing, but historically has been a very top-down discipline that tests hypotheses about behavior using demographic data. So we try to explain the data in terms of, fitness or cultural evolution, these kinds of things that explain why people behave in the way they do. Why do they have children when they do? Why do they have as many children as they do, and so on. So just one quick example, because that's really all we have time for. I like this example as somebody who's worked a little bit more on mortality than on fertility, which is somewhat less common in ecological evolutionary demography. This one should be familiar to most of the folks, I think, who are at this talk already, but so this is a question here, I think a question that's relevant to some of the folks who are in the audience now, if not everyone, is whether there are limits to the human lifespan and how that affects human longevity and all of the different life history stages that happen in between. These are questions that are still interesting and they're still being debated. And so for both mainstream demographers and evolutionary demographers, we think that understanding variation in human mortality is a primary aim of the discipline. One thing that helps to do that is to establish a baseline mortality pattern that helps us to understand what sorts of factors affect mortality at different ages relative to what we think of as the sort of standard pattern. Early on in this kind of understanding of human mortality, when we were trying to characterize it, what the average human mortality pattern might look like, based on evidence that was drawn largely from bioarchaeology and paleodemography, a number of scholars echoed Hobbes in inferring a nasty, brutish, and short life, consisting of low infant mortality but relatively high adult mortality. We can explain why that pattern might exist, but really after a couple of decades of thinking in this way, Mike Girvin and Hilly Kaplan, who I mentioned previously, based on their understanding of chimpanzees and their work in small hunting and gathering communities, and then their own thoughts about how the ways that humans operate might affect lifespan and longevity, they compiled demographic data from a number of small-scale human societies that had been minimally impacted by something that you might sort of call modernization. And you can see, based on the data that they have, I don't know if I have a pointer or something like that, but the data that they compile.
If you just use your mouse, we'll see it.
Oh, okay. My mouse is making it change. I can't show the mouse, but anyway, you are probably familiar with these kinds of data charts in any case, right? Overall, there are some slight differences between different populations, but they sort of converge on a trend that looks something like this. This is how we redrew it. that there's a high mortality, there's a Siler distribution with a relatively high mortality in infancy and early childhood that levels off and then starts to slowly get higher again at advanced ages. And importantly, one of the things that they saw based on the data is that something like a quarter of the population in these hunting and gathering communities, which we can infer would be more like an ancestral human population, would have lived as grandparents for 15 to 20 years. And that is even seen in wild chimpanzee populations. So this idea that humans had a very short, brutish life, I think isn't well supported by data from contemporary small-scale societies. So what does this mean? I think there are lots of questions that are of interest to both mainstream demographers and to people in evolutionary ecology. If we're thinking about how we drive down mortality and extend longevity, one of the common thought is that it's by improved hygiene, healthcare, and infrastructure, but actually the major declines in human mortality appear to have happened long before these were in place, probably because due to things like Ronald Lee studies, intergenerational transfers, and widespread sharing. So these are things that had already drastically reduced human mortality. Does this mean that hygiene, infrastructure, and so on have no effect? The answer there is also no. Oscar Berger, who's also a contributor to the volume in PNAS several years ago, published this paper that showed that the minimum probability of death for humans since major improvements in hygiene, industrialization, and so on in these sort of highly developed countries has gone down much farther, at an order of magnitude farther than even these kind of initial declines in mortality that happen in hunting and gathering communities compared to a chimpanzee-like ancestor. So there have been much steeper declines in recent human history in industrialized nations that have the lowest mortality. So we say that in the chapter, EED addresses lots of areas of interest to mainstream demography with some complementary perspectives that provide this kind of theoretical top-down approach that provides in this specific example a kind of gut check on explanations of mortality. Not that hygiene and so on don't matter, but that this kind of sharing that characterizes humans that we've known about for a long time in HBE also has effects on human life histories and mortality patterns. And there's so much more. I feel very rushed in 10 minutes to give 12,000 word chapter presentation. So you'll have to go back to the book and many of the other wonderful contributions in the same volume to find out more. Thank you very much. That's it. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat or ask when you're allowed to ask, I guess. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Siobhán. That was great. Thanks for compressing it all into such a compact message. Let me just start with a question that I was just typing out, which was when you talk about the major mortality declines occurring before that, are you talking about the transition to the evolutionary transition to Homo sapiens? Are you talking about agriculture? What time period are you referring to is the major decline in mortality?
So this is based on work from Mike Gervin, Hilly Kaplan, Kim Hill, other people collecting data in these foraging communities that are most often being used as analogs of sort of ancestral humans in the Pleistocene, basically. So it's a transition. We don't know whether the kinds of cooperation that characterize Homo sapiens in small scale communities and in our deep evolutionary past, how far back that goes, but certainly Homo sapiens, whenever this kind of widespread sharing would have occurred, that would be the point at which we would expect these kinds of mortality patterns to shift.
And definitely, I would just add, well before agriculture, we would see a different shift in agriculture towards higher mortality. We also discussed this in the chapter.
Yes, this Neolithic revolution, high morbidity, but low mortality, right, situation is an interesting question. Abby Page and some folks have studied that also.
Super. We have a question from Leora about food production, so a little bit related to that. Why do you think that so food availability or something like that didn't dramatically change, say, the human mortality schedule?
That is a great question, and different people probably have slightly different answers to that. I think what channeling Hilly and Mike, they would say that there was this big shift to sort of hunting meat that was also facilitated by cooperation, and that in the process of hunting and sharing meat widely across these individuals in these small camps, that they were then reducing the shortfall, the likelihood of shortfall. And so that would have had this, the implication there is that the nutrition would have been much more consistent, and that nutritional support would have been directly fed into lowering mortality.
And again, I'll just add to that, that in the Neolithic revolution, so the shift to agriculture, the additional food, most people argue went into increasing fertility specifically. So it's increasing fertility, but with this potential rise in either morbidity or mortality or both, depending on which data you look at.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name. The woman at Bristol, Mari Gibson, has some great work on that, actually. She has a really interesting series of papers looking at how this isn't about food per se, but women who had historically been involved in walking something like 6 hours a day in search of water. They got access to water taps, their energy goes up, energy availability goes up, but instead of that improving their health, they just ended up pregnant more often. And so the outcomes in terms of morbidity were actually a bit worse, if I recall correctly.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much, Siobhán, and also Mary, for participating in the Q&A. It was great to have you join also. Sorry to be so brief, but stick around. We're going to have, I hope, some open discussion after all three talks. So please stick around. And now we have our next speaker, Felix Tropf. Let's see. Well, Felix is getting ready. So this is by Melinda Mills at Oxford, and Felix also, who's actually, I'm not sure where you said you were. You're now at ENSE in Paris. Is that right, Felix?
I'm hiding in Paris now. Yeah.
Yeah. Felix is a sociologist with a focus on social demography, genetics, and the life course. And they're going to be talking about their chapter, Genetics and Preproductive Behavior Review, but that in the spirit of the event, they've shortened their title to Human Genetics and Fertility. So thanks so much, Felix, and thanks for joining us from overseas.
Thanks so much for having me, and also thank you again for the exciting opportunity to contribute to this really great volume. A special thanks to Oscar, who apparently is not here today, but for his help editing. So I want to talk exactly about human genetics and fertility. I have a poppier title maybe, and I might be a bit more the high school student here when I talk about some of the evolutionary aspects, but I'm curious what all of you think. It's exciting research though, I find, and yeah, Melinda Mills is professor in Oxford. I'm at the Center for Research in Economics and Statistics at Paris since a year, and before I had the opportunity to work with her like for quite a while. I shortly want to thank, of course, all the funders. 10 years ago, the party started with Melinda in Holland with the NVO, with the Dutch Science Foundation, and she's still supported by the European Research Council, and I'm now in the laboratory for excellence in economics, actually in France. So we studied the genetics of fertility, partly also in education, because it's so strong intertwined, right? Education and fertility in our life courses. Based on Hans-Peter Kohler, who in 1999 asked the question, is fertility in the genes? There was this project coming up, and so at that point, I was probably one of the first PhD students in social genomics, but Melinda was already an expert in how social and institutional factors influence fertility tempo and fertility quantum. And when we talk about fertility tempo, we talk about the age at first birth, the time between parities, between first, second, third child, and so forth. In fertility quantum, we usually talk about the number of children that you have throughout your life course. And we know, for example, that if you have if you stay longer enrolled in education, you have your age at first birth much later, and especially women have then also fewer children throughout their life. However, at that time, particularly, there was surprisingly little known about biological or genetic predictors of fertility outcomes, at least on a population level. And this is very exciting and interesting research for several reasons. So, of course, for me as a social demographer, I find it very interesting to know to what extent are differences in a population in fertility due to biological factors or genetic factors or to social factors, also to give myself a reference for the social factors that I try to integrate into my statistical model. So how much do I actually want to explain? There's of course a study we want to, there's of course a story for medical sciences in there. We want to educate people about their reproductive ability also as a function of age. And there's an evolutionary biological story in it. And I mean, this is probably for all of you very naive, or I'm really looking forward to feedback. I'm ambitious to learn more, but basically the question of evolution, natural selection as a process driving evolution, is the question whether we successfully transmit our genes to the next generation. And this can be seen as a question of mortality and surviving up until a reproductive ages beyond. So we all want to reproduce. Can we make it? Or in modern societies where child mortality is very low, and in general mortality up until reproductive age is diminished, is really low. The question is more, do you have children, and how many children do you have? So if there are genetic variants that are associated with having more children, those might be more frequent in subsequent generations, and this would be a process indicating natural selection. So fertility came a bit to the focus here, and at the same time, if we think about it a bit more, a bit longer, we could also say like, oh, okay, if there are genetic variants that are not passed on, after a while, there should just be no genetic variants in fertility or any fitness-related trait. So this was is part of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. So is fertility actually heritable? And if so, of course, why? And what we see here is a little graph that there are very many studies from different countries, from different places on age at first birth, or number of children, from males, for females, and all find some sort of heritability with differing degrees. So there seems to be some sort of heterogeneity, but on the x-axis you see heritability estimates, and on the y-axis you see like a really large number of studies showing that there is genetic variation still in fertility behavior. This is a chart, I trust you see my cursor. This is a chart investigating heterogeneity in genetic effects on fertility, but a bit more complex. It's not only the question like how strongly do genes influence fertility, but also are the same genes associated with fertility. So what you see here is very simplified. The blue stacks of the bars are like universal effects, and the colored ones are genetic associations that are specific to certain environments. To specifically, if you are in a specific country, or if you live at a specific time in history, and then even more specific, like with or without effective contraception, namely the pill. And what you see is like 5 phenotypes, like education, age at first birth, number of children, BMI, and height. And you see like for height, for example, most of the effects are just universal, and actually the best model fit is for a universal model. So all the genetic associations across countries and time are the same. But for education, only half of the heritability within a population is actually universal, and the rest is due to living in a specific population. And it's basically the genetic association with education can change depending on where you live. And this is also for age at first birth, and this is super strong for number of children. So the number of children, the genetic associations with number of children can largely differ depending on where you live. So also indicating a bit like that natural selection promotes heterogeneity across populations. However, what we find is even if we look at molecular genetic data, not twin studies with very strong assumptions and everything, we find that around 15% of the differences in age at first birth and around 10% in the differences in number of children ever born can be associated with genetic differences between individuals. And these are also correlated. So this means that that basically natural selection would promote an earlier onset of reproduction. Here we see with the UK Biobank this super, you probably heard of it, like 500,000 genotyped individuals in the UK. On the x-axis you see birth cohorts, on the y-axis you see SNP heritability, so molecular genetic heritability. And you see that heritability almost doubles and really significantly increases across the second half of the 20th century, at least for age at first birth or women. So it's not only there, it might also get, or it got more important genetic effects on fertility in the UK. What is super thrilling and so there are a couple of traits that we find like persistent genetic correlations with number of children, like age at first birth or education, but the actual trend is always in the other direction. So while we would genetically expect that the people get earlier and earlier their first child, they get it later and later. So part of this chapter is a discussion how genes and environment disagree, and that the environment is just, or what others call the ecological framework is more important and trumps the potentially ongoing natural selection that is true, but not necessarily as relevant. Finally, let's say the highest discipline there is like really finding the regions on the genome that are associated, not only heritability studies, but that are actually associated with fertility outcomes in those regions, to understand actually what they are doing. And so the first study on this had been conducted 2016 on number of children and age at first birth, and identified 12 loci, 12 SNPs, based on 300,000 individuals. I'm not sure, probably you're all familiar with the concept of polygenicity. So basically we have a lot of SNPs, a lot of genetic variants with small effects that contribute. So if we increase the number of people, we find more of them because of statistical power. And so there is a new study from 2020. It's currently on bioRxiv, 2 studies actually, one on number of children, one of number of children and childlessness, and one on reproductive timing, so age at first birth and also age at first sexual intercourse, with overall more than 750,000 individuals, more than 400 genomic loci have been identified. And they are linked to diverse aspects of reproduction across the life course, like puberty timing, sex hormones, age at menopause, and so forth. So what you would also expect from theory, but also some behavioral stuff like externalizing behavior and so forth, and a strong link to education. One thing I would want to finally highlight is so we find all this heterogeneity, or in the literature as well, there's this heterogeneity, and this is really spectacular, but especially for fertility. But one of these, this is a so-called Manhattan plot of a genetic discovery, where you have on the y-axis the p-values, and on the x-axis you have like all these millions of genetic variants, and if they are significant, then you look like you dive into this and try to understand what's going on here. One of those is like a FATS gene. I'm not a biologist. I'm not, but what I learned is that this specific genetic variant has been under natural selection since 10,000 years. So this is a paper currently under review, and this is really interesting because of many things, but one is also because of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection and stuff, and that why do we find genetic variants? and shouldn't it be trimmed? So this allele has changed, or in this SNP, the allele frequency has changed in the last 10,000 years from 10% to 90%. And we can learn so much from it, because usually what we find is a lot of gene environment, and let's say suggestive gene environment interaction, that always different areas on the genome are actually under selection, and then it's not very meaningful because it's so rapidly changing. But it's also interesting to find something that is persistently under selection. And just this is I find it quite beautiful. So if
Felix,
you,
we're beginning to run out of time a bit. So how many more slides do you have?
Last one.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. So here you see that the genetic predisposition for number of children increased over time in 2 independent studies in UK and US. And this is cool because actually the number of children decreases, and you want to know whether this gene environment disagreement, whether this is all speculative, but this shows that on the genetic level, the predisposition increases. And so to last word, like reproductive traits are potentially increasingly or partly increasingly heritable. Genetic variants have been robustly identified with fertility. Behavioral and biological traits are genetically associated, and natural selection operates directionally. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Super, Felix. Sorry to cut you off there at the end. We're getting lots. I get the sense that this is a topic that we could all discuss for hours. But let me just, we're getting very animated questions here. Let me just pick 2. The first is from Bobby Schell, who's concerned about population stratification in the analysis. Do you see this as being more or less a solved problem, or is it still an open problem in terms of the GWAS studies?
In general, I mean, okay. I have a, we control for the standard controls to control for population stratification, like principal components. It's not solved. It has been shown that this is not solved by principal components. There are mixed linear models with matrices and stuff like that. I don't know. I think since this analysis is conducted on many samples, you have an additional problem, because you do a meta-analysis across, let's say, 5 cohorts, and you don't have the population stratification between them. But I was actually, just one sentence, I was actually wondering whether you need that for that question. Do you actually need to control for population stratification at all if you investigate a natural selection? So that would be my counter.
I'll leave that question open. Let me just take the second question, which Jim was asking and I was also asking, which is non-humans. Do you, I guess we'll ask it in terms of expectations. Would you expect the same kind of diversity in non-humans, and is there any evidence for it?
I have to play here with the open cards, so I'm not, I don't know about mice and stuff. So there are, I find that is super important. We're doing experiments with, I think, zebrafish, to understand whether it's, to what extent there's reproductive biology going on, but I cannot transfer my, it depends. I would say less so, because the genetic correlations are more with behavior. We can highlight puberty timing, and age and menopause, but the strongest correlations are still with more behavioral traits. So maybe not.
So let me, a question for Jim, maybe to answer in chat. Are there review studies of this across species? That's more a question for Jim in chat.
There's one study that I'm aware of, but that's very outdated. I would please do it. No, not that I know. I mean, we reviewed the literature then, and we find that. So, for example, there's an interesting finding for males. There are SNPs that are specifically for males associated, and those have been associated with sperm counts in other species. So this is very interesting. But for me, the overwhelming impression is always, when I look at the statistics, that behavior plays almost a bigger role than biology.
Great. Okay, thank you, Felix. Please stick around for the Gather Town chat. I know people want to ask you more questions if you have time. I know it's already late there. Okay, so now we are going to turn to our own Ron Lee. We've heard about, in our first talk, about why species might differ and how they do. In our second talk, we heard about how humans might differ from each other. And now we're going to hear Ron talking about, get his title up, sorry. I'm waiting for his title to come up. His theoretical approach, sociality, food sharing, and the evolution of life histories. I think this was probably alluded to in Siobhán's talk. So thanks, Ron. We're running a little bit late. We're starting you about 5 minutes late. So I'm gonna try to cut you off at 1, if that's okay, Ron. I see you have 15 slides, so I probably will cut you off, and then we'll have a few minutes of discussion. And then we'll open up the floor for continued discussion.
I'll talk as fast as I can.
Thanks, Ron.
So this is work with Carl. Oh, you hear me? Yes?
Yes, everything's good. We can see the slides. We can hear you clearly.
Okay. So Carl Bow is somewhere among the people in this Zoom. So if offspring of any species were limited to the food energy they could acquire themselves, it would severely constrain their life history options. For many species, that is the case. But for humans and many other species, there is parental support for the young over a longer period. And we can imagine how this could evolve if the transfer of some food from a mother to her offspring would cost her in fitness less than half as much as her offspring would gain in fitness as a result of receiving the transfer. Then her total fitness with direct and indirect contributions would be raised. And so we could imagine this evolving. And in this way, a species like humans with very long delayed maturity and a very prolonged heavy investment in the big brain becomes evolutionarily possible. But then if a species lineage does get involved in intergenerational transfers in this way, then the intergenerational transfer practices shape the way that natural selection is going to be shaping the rest of the life history. And perhaps best known, as Siobhán was saying, if older adults continue to make transfers to the young, even when they're in a post-reproductive age, then there will continue to be natural selection for post-reproductive survival. So that's a way that the evolution of intergenerational trade-offs, transfers can shape other aspects. Now, just to make it more concrete, here we have reduction by age, the red curve for a number of hunter-gatherer populations averaged, and the blue line is consumption by age. And we can see that the young are nutritionally dependent until age 20 or so, remarkably long. Let's see, this is, well, okay, we'll go with this. And we also see that the elderly continue to make transfers to the young, even far into old age in post-reproductive. So that's the sort of thing I was describing. Now,
Ron, I'm losing your sound.
Parental care.
When you move back and forth, we lose your sound.
Parental care creates new risks and threats to fitness, because the death of a parent then would entail the death of dependent offspring. and that would be a great loss of fitness. And second, there's a sort of life cycle dependency squeeze, which I could go on to the next slide to explain. This, I think, was first noted by the Russian economist Shayanov in the 1920s. And this is a slide based on his paper. And what you see here is the ratio of effective consumers to effective workers by year of the family's existence. And you can see here
Ron,
that
we're still seeing the old slide. Can you move to the next one?
from the time of the Union formation to about the 13th year of the Union. Now, in humans, these problems are somewhat alleviated by broader social sharing, going beyond just the family group.
Ron, you still have the old slide.
Sorry, Ron.
You still have the old slide.
Yeah.
You're not seeing these.
No, we're seeing
Oh,
slide 3.
Okay. Well, we'll go back to this then. All right. So the broader social sharing, first of all, means that if a parent dies, then others in the sharing group may continue supporting the children, a form of life insurance. And in a broader sharing group, the groups are larger, and so the population age distribution is generally closer to a stable population age distribution, and these the life cycle squeeze gets sort of smoothed across, resulting in a more efficient reproductive cycle. But then social sharing, once it has evolved, and this could be partly cultural as well as genetic, but social sharing further shapes life histories because it leads to a kind of genetic or evolutionary free riding. The selection I talked about that would continue to bring strengthen post-reproductive survival would be weakened by this sort of life insurance effect. And now higher fertility, a mother having an additional birth will have a less negative impact on the siblings because the costs of that additional birth are shared within the group. And so higher fertility will evolve, fertility higher than the optimal. And an infant death or child death now entails loss of future transfers that would have been received from others in the group. And so it becomes more costly to the mother, and there's stronger selection for low infant and child mortality. All of this reducing average reproductive fitness, even though in the context of the group, it promotes the mother's fitness. Well, Carl and I explore these issues for human hunter-gatherers in a micro-simulation, single-sex population. There's mutation accumulation taking place, shaping the age distribution of mortality. I'll skip over all these details, I think, and just go straight to the kinds of things we find, because there's really some time to go into it. So we do this, we're simulating a population of individuals that are related to one another, and they form sharing groups of different kinds. And so here are the 3 kinds we simulate, or among the ones we simulate. At M100, that's a matriarchal group, close to a nuclear family, really, in which the oldest living female in the line and all her descendants form a sharing group, but they really only share with one another, with no one else. Then we have A5. This is 5 generations of kin, that is kin up to 3rd cousins, live together in a sharing group, and they also only share within their group. That's what 100 means. And then we have the SG K550. That means a sharing group composed of typically 3 or 4 of the K5 type subgroups that go up to third cousin. Some of the sharing group will be unrelated to one another, others will be kin. And each of those 3 or 4 households keeps half of their food for themselves and puts the other half in a common pot. And this roughly corresponds to what ethnographic studies of food sharing and living arrangements find for hunter-gatherer groups. So the larger groups, there's more smoothing and more life insurance. And we see this here. This is some of the simulation output. This is infant and child mortality conditional on whether the mother is alive at the start of the interval down here or dies. And this is the M100, the smallest matriarchal social arrangement. And we see, and there's a huge difference in survival for kids in that case. We see for the 5-generation sharing group, the difference is much reduced. And for the broader sharing group with 3 or 4 of these 5 households, then there's hardly any difference and mortality much lower. This is not because people are better fed, it's an evolved difference. Okay.
So
Then
Ron,
here we have
we're pretty much out of time. We're going to give you a couple more minutes.
this slide and the next.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll be quick, I think. Okay, so this is the evolved age pattern of mortality. This one, the green line, is with the matriarchal groups. You can see it has relatively high infant and child mortality, and it has a lot of post-reproductive survival. And then here we have the broadest sharing group, and you see it has lower infant and child mortality, and it also has extensive post-reproductive survival. Now, the last slide I want to show addresses the question, well, which of these social arrangements confers the highest fitness benefit? And so here we put the 3 groups in competition with one another, three instances of each kind of group, so there are a total of 9 groups. They're all living in the same area, so they all experience the same population density, and higher population density makes foraging more difficult. We see that in these circumstances, the matriarchal groups, the smaller ones with less life insurance and more life cycle squeeze, they go extinct in a few thousand years. The intermediate ones, the 5-generational kin group, also gets outcompeted. It cannot survive and reproduce at the higher densities at which the broader sharing group is able to live. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that conveys some of the flavor of what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Super interesting. Let's see, we have a question from Siobhán, picking up on your discussion of sharing and infant mortality versus sharing and fertility. She asks, what portion of sharing food is allocated to increases in fertility versus reductions in child mortality?
The question probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it just set off a light bulb for me, actually, that a lot of these kind of models of human behavior and the effect of sharing on the human life course, they often sort of partition out different aspects of the life course like mortality, but then it's also responsible for this increase in fertility and the decrease in birth spacing. But food sharing, you know, like energy in general, has to be partitioned across these different kinds of activities. So is that incorporated into this model, or, you know, associated models, or isn't it? Does it matter?
Well, I think that could be extracted, but most of these patterns you see are not due directly to, well, there's more food available, so people live longer, or there's not. It's mostly evolved behavior that we're seeing, so that the sort of the baseline around which variations in food availability would lead to higher or lower fertility or higher or lower mortality changes as a result of evolution, and the sorts of genes that affect birth intervals and things like that Felix was talking about. Yeah, so there's genetic evolution taking place in the simulation, and that's mostly what's driving the outcomes. But it would be possible to parse out what part is due specifically to food availability given that genetic substructure. But I haven't done it.
Technical question, is this Berkeley's own SOCSIM at work, or is this something bespoke?
This is not SOCSIM, although there was a team at Max Planck that was working on trying to address the same problems using SOCSIM. This is built from ground up initially by Tim Miller and myself, and Tim was doing the programming, and then taken over by Carl Boe. So yeah, it's dedicated to this purpose, and I mean, you know, as one says, it doesn't really have marriage explicitly or implicitly. So no, it's not SOCSIM. It's similar in conception, I guess.
And then the other question I had is your last slide where you showed the population that was doing best. I got confused about the labels, and I just is that that was the in between? Tell us which population that was, and give us a little intuition on why that. It's the most sharing?
Well, it's the most sharing. It's the ethnographically more or less the actual kind of arrangement that is observed. That is sharing groups of 8 to 25 people during the lean season of the year, maybe the 5 or 6 months when food is least available and groups have to move around rather than being more concentrated. So that's from Binsford's ethnographic analysis. Why does it benefit? Well, on the one hand, it has the distortions of the free riding kind I was talking about, but on the other hand, it has the advantages of a smoother age distribution and this life endurance and so on that seem to outweigh those other problems.
Is this this?
I should say, no.
How would you
There's
position?
a whole other direction. Go ahead.
How would you position the transfers and sharing in relation to the group selection discussion? Is it the same thing, just with more detail, or is this a different concept?
I would say this selection going on here is individual. That is, that's what's programmed in. But in that last slide, I would say that's looking at group selection for different social arrangements. Groups of different social arrangements, so we don't know, you know, that would be true whether or not those were culturally defined or genetically defined. I think there was a whole lot of genetics, evolved behavior going into that, and then with cultural modifications on top. But there seems to be a lot of uniformity across observed hunter-gatherer groups, very different in many ways, but in these ways they seem to be fairly similar, unless of course there are differences in resource base, like they're back mounted hunting or shellfish at the gathering of the seas or something like that. This would be, you know, for Amazon basin or maybe Kalahari, which is where specific age profiles.
Okay, thank you so much, Ron. Okay, we're now going to shift to our post-brown bag programming. Dennis, could you repost the link at the bottom of the messages, just so we'll have it? So what you do is you click on this link, and it will open up something in your browser. And then we're going to rejoin for informal conversation. But before we depart, everybody can turn off their mute and clap loudly for another thought-provoking and exciting session. I apologize to all the speakers for not giving them enough time to talk, but you left us wanting more. So I hope you'll be happy about that. Very exciting talks. I'm